2 Stanley Cups, 3 All-Star nods, 54 goals in a single season. Kevin Stevens was everything the NHL wanted a power forward to be. Size, violence, scoring, and spectacle. The league rewarded every hit, celebrated every goal, and sold every ticket it could off the back of the way he played. Then the prescriptions came. Then the addiction came. Then nobody came at all. The early 90s Pittsburgh Penguins were Mario Lemieux's team, and everybody understood that, but Mario did not win those 2 cups alone. The man riding shotgun was Kevin Stevens, 6'3" and 230 pounds of left winger who could finish like a sniper and hit you like he had a personal grudge. And for a stretch of about 4 seasons, he was the most complete power forward in the sport. Pittsburgh took back-to-back championships in 1991 and 1992, and Stevens was the only Penguin who played in every single regular season and playoff game across both of those runs. That is not a stat for a role player. That's the stat of a man the whole operation leaned on. The 1991-92 season is where the ceiling became visible to everyone watching. Stevens put up 54 goals and 69 assists for 123 points, which made him the runner-up in league scoring behind only Lemieux, and it set the record for the highest single-season point total ever recorded by an American-born player. He finished ahead of Wayne Gretzky in the scoring race that year, only the 3rd player in NHL history to outscore Gretzky in a full season, and he did it while collecting more than 250 penalty minutes, which meant he was beating you on the scoreboard and punishing you physically on the same shift. Only 3 other players in the entire history of the league have ever posted 50 goals and 200 penalty minutes in the same season. Stevens did not play like a man who had to choose between skill and violence. He played like a man who refused to believe the choice existed. The following year, he scored 55 goals, which tied the record for the most ever by an American-born player. And that record stood for 29 years until Austin Matthews broke it in 2022. 2 consecutive 50-goal seasons, 2 Stanley Cup rings already in his pocket, and he was still only 28 years old. The hockey world was not watching a peak. It was watching what it assumed was the early phase of a Hall of Fame career. And if you had asked anyone around him what kind of person he was, the answer would have surprised you, given how he played. His teammates described him as the most fun guy in the room, the one everybody gravitated toward, a player whose work ethic matched the personality and whose leadership his coaches talked about openly. He was not a villain, and he was not a cautionary tale waiting to happen. He was the kind of player a franchise builds its entire identity around, and Pittsburgh did exactly that. Because that is the part you need to understand before any of the rest makes sense. The league didn't just tolerate what Stevens was. It celebrated every piece of it. The size, the collisions, the willingness to absorb damage and inflict it on the same shift. And nobody at any level ever stopped to ask what that reward system might eventually cost the men inside it. May 14th, 1993, Game 7, second round of the playoffs, Penguins against the New York Islanders. Pittsburgh was chasing a 3rd straight Stanley Cup, and early in the first period, Stevens did what he had done hundreds of times before. He chased down Islanders defenseman Rich Pilon along the boards to finish a check, the kind of hit he had built his reputation on, and as he came in, the top edge of Pilon's visor caught him flush across the face. The force of the contact knocked Stevens unconscious in midair. His arms went limp. He couldn't brace himself, couldn't get his hands up, and he landed face first on the ice with the full weight of his body behind him. Grant Jennings, a Penguins defenseman, skated up to him and heard the breathing first. Stevens was out cold, and the sound coming from him was wrong, labored, and shallow. And Jennings would later say that everybody on both teams stopped where they were. Nobody cared about the score. It took medical staff roughly 6 minutes to get Stevens off the ice and onto his stretcher. And what followed was a 4.5-hour surgery that reads like something out of a trauma ward. Surgeons cut an incision across his skull from ear to ear below the hairline, peeled his face back, and rebuilt the shattered bones underneath with metal plates and more than 100 stitches. His orbital bone was broken, his cheek was broken, and his nose and teeth were destroyed. Glenn Healy, who was in goal for the Islanders that night, said years later that the doctors described Stevens' face as being like a cracked egg, and that he was never the same player after it. Stevens came back the following season and scored 41 goals in 83 games, which is an extraordinary number for a man who had his face reconstructed 5 months earlier, but the people watching closely could see the difference. He pulled back from the collisions that used to define him, and the willingness to put his body into the places where damage lived was no longer fully there. Nobody who understood what he had been through could blame him for it. But the injury on the ice was only half of what happened to him. Out of that surgery came prescriptions and painkillers. And this is where the clean version of the story, the one where the injury creates the addiction in a straight line, falls apart. Because Stevens has always been honest about the timeline. More honest than the people telling his story usually are. By his own account, he had already started using a controlled substance before the 1993 injury. The drug use wasn't born in a hospital. It was already there, quiet and early. And what the painkillers did was detonate it. Stevens himself has described it in exactly those terms. He said the can of worms was already open, and then the pain medication walked in, and from there it was a runaway train. So the question that hangs over everything that follows is not the simple one. It's not whether the injury caused the addiction, because Stevens himself says it did not entirely. The question is harder than that. When a franchise player walks out of reconstructive surgery carrying a prescription that is about to meet a problem nobody around him has noticed yet, whose job is it to be paying attention? The decline didn't happen all at once. It happened in a way these things usually do. One stop at a time, each one a little quieter than the last. After the 1994-95 season, Stevens was traded from Pittsburgh to the Boston Bruins. From Boston, he went to the Los Angeles Kings. From the Kings, he was traded to the New York Rangers. None of these were lateral moves. Each one took him further from the center of the sport, and the numbers backed it up. The man who had scored 50 goals twice broke the 20-goal mark only once more after leaving Pittsburgh. The hockey world watched the production fall and called it what fading careers always get called. A player losing a step, a body wearing down, the natural end of a physical player's shelf life. It was something else entirely, and the people closest to him knew it. January 23rd, 2000. Stevens was with the Rangers, and the team had just played the Blues in St. Louis. Hours after the game, police arrived at a motel in Collinsville, Illinois, a suburb on the eastern side of the Mississippi. Inside the room, they found Stevens, a controlled substance, drug paraphernalia, roughly $3,000 in cash, and a woman police identified as a prostitute. He was charged with felony drug possession and released on bail. The mugshot went everywhere. The headlines wrote themselves. And the career, in any meaningful sense, was finished. Here is the part the league would rather nobody linger on. By the time of that arrest in Collinsville, Stevens had already been through the NHL's Substance Abuse and Behavioral Health program once before. The program had existed since 1996, created jointly by the league and the Players Union, and it was voluntary, confidential, and available to any player who needed it. Stevens knew about it. He had used it, and he still ended up in that motel room with a crack pipe. That tells you something. Not about his willpower, but about what a voluntary program can actually accomplish when the culture around it treats asking for help as a sign of weakness. The program existed, but a program is not the same thing as a system built to catch people. A program that waits for a player to walk through the door on his own, in a sport where toughness is the currency and vulnerability is a career risk, is designed for the version of addiction that announces itself politely and asks for directions. That is not the version Kevin Stevens had, and he was not alone in that. The physical era NHL produced a pattern that became impossible to ignore over time. Bob Probert, Derek Bugard, Rick Rippon, Steve Montador, all physical era players whose lives bent around some combination of the same forces, pain, prescriptions, dependency, isolation. Some of them didn't survive long enough to tell anyone about it. The names are different, and the details vary, but the shape of the story is the same every time. And the league's fingerprints are on every version of it. The question was never whether the NHL knew its players were struggling. The question is what a program can actually do when the culture around it still calls asking for help a weakness. The 2000 arrest was not the end of it. That is the part most people don't know, because the story, as it usually gets told, stops there, at the mugshot and the felony charge, as though the fall had a floor. It didn't. Stevens bounced to the Philadelphia Flyers and then back to Pittsburgh for a final stint before retiring in 2002. He moved into scouting for the Penguins, stayed in the game's orbit, and from the outside, it looked like something resembling stability. But more than a decade after the arrest in Collinsville, the addiction that had started before that 1993 surgery and accelerated through everything that followed was still running. In November 2015, Massachusetts State Police stopped Stevens and found him carrying 175 oxycodone pills, each containing 30 milligrams intended for redistribution. He was 50 years old. The pills belonged to the same family of painkillers that had first been prescribed to him after his face was rebuilt with metal plates 22 years earlier, and he was now selling them. Federal prosecutors charged Stevens with conspiracy to process with intent to distribute oxycodone. He pleaded guilty in a Boston federal court in December 2016, and the government asked for a year in prison. The sentencing hearing, by every account, was one of those rare courtroom moments where the full weight of a life lands in a single room. Stevens' attorney argued that the conduct traced directly back to the 1993 injury and the addiction that followed it. Prosecutors did not dispute the connection, and U.S. District Judge George O'Toole, weighing the wreckage against the progress Stevens had made towards sobriety since his arrest, chose not to send him to prison. 3 years of probation, a $10,000 fine, and a condition that Stevens give motivational talks about addiction, which meant the court was asking him to turn the worst thing in his life into something useful for other people. Stevens stood in that courtroom and said what he had never been able to outrun. He wished none of it had ever happened. He said he had hurt his family, his kids, his parents, everybody. And then he walked out and did the work. He got sober. He stayed in the Penguins organization as a scout and started showing up for other players, speaking publicly about what addiction looks like from the inside, telling kids and anyone else who would listen that it can happen to anyone, that it doesn't care how many goals you scored or how many parades you rode through. In December 2024, Kevin Stevens was inducted into the United States Hockey Hall of Fame, recognized alongside the career he nearly buried, and the ceremony acknowledged what the highlight reels never had, that the hardest thing he ever did was not scoring 54 goals or winning 2 Stanley Cups. It was surviving what came after. So how does a man go from 2 championships and a scoring record to a federal drug charge? Not because he was weak, because a problem that started small got detonated by an injury that the sport's own style of play invited. And the safety net underneath him, even when it existed on paper, was never strong enough to hold a man falling that fast. The program was there. The culture around it was not. Every time a league sells a physical product without reckoning with what that product does to the men inside it, there's a bill that comes due. Kevin Stevens paid a version of that bill for more than 25 years. He is not the exception. He's the evidence. Kevin Stevens gave this sport every pound of himself it asked for. The goals, the body, the highlight reel hits it put on the marquee. What it owed him back was simpler than a program or a press release. It was somebody paying attention before the bottom of it all, instead of after. If you want to go deeper into the stories the NHL would rather you forget and get early access to videos before they're released, that is exactly what the Healthy Scratch membership is for. The link is below. There is another one coming. Another name the game lifted up and then quietly let fall. Subscribe now, because you'll want to be here when it goes up.